Good day, everyone. My name is Jason Calarian, and I am here to report the Module 2 of Institutional Based Correction. Objectives. At the end of this lesson, the students will be able to know the history, philosophy, and objectives of imprisonment and the development of prisons. Sing Sing Prison, Auburn System, Pennsylvania System. In 5, deployment of prisoners, forms of punishment, age of enlightenment, and the personalities behind correctional institutions. Cesare, Marquis of Beccaria, Bonicia, Cesare Lombroso, William the Conqueror, Enrico Ferri, and Clifford Shaw. What is prison? Also known as jail or goal detention center, correction center, correctional facility, lockup or remand center, is a facility in which inmates or prisoners are confined against their will and usually define a variety of freedoms under the authority of the state as punishment for various crimes. So, ang prison, mo ni ang mga kuan na lugar o balay sa mga piniriso o sa katong mga offenders nga nakasala sa community, mga nagbuwat og mga criminal acts. Prisons are most commonly used within a criminal justice system. People charged with crimes may be imprisoned until their trial. Those pleading or being found guilty of crimes at trial may be sentenced to the specific period of imprisonment. In simplest terms, a prison can also be described as a building in which people are legally held as a punishment for a crime they have committed. So, matong ingon ganiya nga balay sa mga nakasala nga mga tawo, ng mga kasala nga tawo, sa mga nagbuwat og mga crime. So, next is prisons can also be used as a tool of political repression. By authoritarian regimes, their perceived opponents may be imprisoned for political crimes, often without trial or other legal due process. This use is illegal under most forms of international law governing fair administration of justice. So, ang kaning prison sa una kay mo ni gihimo as a prisohanan sa mga kuan, like sa mga prisoners of war, sa mga political repression nya, direct ra sila priso without any kuan kaning legal due process. In times of war, prisoners of war or detainees may be detained in military prisons or prisoner of war camps, and large groups of civilians might be imprisoned in internment camps. So mao ni example, mga prisoners of war, wala ni sila niagi og legal due process, dito ra detained sa mga kuan, labi na sa mga Nazi government. For example, Nazi government, mga large groups of prisoners of war kay direct ra gipriso. Ancient and medieval. Some ancient Greek philosophers such as Plato began to develop ideas of using punishment to reform offenders instead of simply using it for its own sake. Imprisonment as a penalty was used initially for those who could not afford to pay their fines. Eventually, since impoverished Athenians could not pay their fines, leading to indefinite period of imprisonment, time limits were set instead. So sa unang panahon na dinay kuha na sa una ka ng bayad-bayad, labi na ka ng kung nakabuhat ka og sala, then mapriso ka, pwede rin mo mabayaran din, pwede na ka makabuhi na ka. So katong mga dili kabayad kay labi na sa katong mga way kwarta kay di sila makagawas mapriso sila pila ka sa pila ka tuig. The prison in ancient Athens was known as the Demosterian place of chain. So money ang kuan prison sa ancient Athens nga ginatawag og Desmoterian. So next, the Romans were among the first to use prisons as a form of punishment rather than simply for detention. A variety of existing structures were used to house prisoners such as metal cages, basements of public buildings, and quarries. So sa mga Romans gihimo ang prison as a didto nila i-punish ang mga offenders. Then ay ilang kuan style sa ilang prison so na dili kuan kanang mga blocks, mga stones, ila is metal cages. One of the most notable Roman prisons was the Mamertine prison, established around 640 before Christ by Angus Marcius. The Mamertine prison was located within a sewer system beneath ancient Rome and contained a large network of dungeons where prisoners were held in squalid condition, contaminated with human waste. So, mao ni ilahang prison. So, init kay mo ni tawag og Mamertine prison. Contaminated with human waste, so meaning kanang naatanan ang nadya ang baho sa mga kuan sa tawo, tae sa tawo, sagol na mga waste. So ma-imagine nimo nga unsa ka dili lalim jud mapriso sa diri nga lugar. In many cases, citizens were sentenced to slavery, often in ergastula, a primitive form of prison where unruly slaves were chained to workbenches and perform hard labor. So sa uban nga citizen, ang uban kay mga ang uban nga mga prisoner is gihimo silang slaves. So kuan pugson og pabuhat og mga kuan butang balag labag sa imong kalooban. Imo jud nang trabahoon kay slaves man. In medieval Songhai, results of a trial could have led to confiscation of merchandise, imprisonment as a form of punishment, since various prisons existed in empire. During the Middle Ages of Europe, castles, fortresses, and the basements of public buildings were often used as makeshift prison. The position of the right and the capability to, to imprison citizens, however, granted an air of legitimacy to officials at all levels and government from kings to regional courts to city councils, and the ability to have someone imprisoned or killed serve as a signifier of who in society possess power or authority others. Other common punishment was sentencing people to galley slavery, which involved chaining prisoners together in the bottoms of ships and forced them to row on naval or merchant vessels. So, makita niyo sa picture mao ni ang galley slavery. So, kani sila tie ni sila og chains dayon gi pugos sila og ano kanang kanang bugsayon ang vessels para sila mo'y silbi sila mo ay nagbugsay para sa vessels nga kung asa i adto og an mo ni silbi as a punishment nila. So ang kani nga galley slavery once nga makasod ka ni for what dili sila makasiguro if nusa sila buhian kay some of sa akong na research is galley slavery silbi a lifetime na ni nga life lifetime na ni nga punishment. Modern era, the influence of French philosopher Michel Foucault, especially his book Disciplined and Punished, The Birth of the Prison, 1975, has energized the historical study of prisons and their role in the overall social system. So, mo ni ang libro niya, Michel Foucault, The Discipline and Punish, is an analysis of the social and theoretical mechanisms behind the changes that occurred in the Western penal system during the modern age based on historical documents from France. So, kani si Michel Foucault kay saan ka French saan siya ka nga French dayon nagsulat siya book about sa prison. So, about unsay mga kalihukan sa prison, unsay naa didto, then iyang gi-describe. So ang title is Discipline and Punish: The Birth of the Prison. Foucault argues that prison did not become a principal form of punishment just because of the humanitarian concerns of reformists. He traces the cultural shifts that lead to the predominance of prisons via the body and power. Prisons used by the disciplines new technological powers that can also be found, according to Foucault, in places such as schools, hospitals, and military barracks. In 17th and 18th century, from the late 17th century and during the 18th century, popular resistance to public execution and torture became more widespread both in Europe and the United States. So sa kaning century, kaning mga 70 to 88, kay uso ang ilang punishment ani is ang death penalty or pag-execute using kaning bitayon ang tawo sa public kanang daghang makita nga mga tawo. Particularly under the Bloody Code, with few sentencing alternatives, imposition of the death penalty for petty crimes such as theft was proving increasingly unpopular with the public. Many jurors were refusing to convict defendants of petty crimes when they knew the defendants would be sentenced to death. Rulers began looking for means to punish and control their subjects in a way that did not cause people to associate them with spectacles of tyrannical and sadistic violence. They developed system of mass incarceration, often hard labor as a solution. So, nakaamgo sa kanila nga time kay nawala-wala na ang mga public execution, mga death penalties, din gi ilisan og mass incarceration. So, kuan kana kuan presohon sila sa presohan dayon with hard labor kanang patrabahoon sila like mag-farm, manglimpyo, unsa pa na diha. The prison reform movement that arose at this time was heavily influenced by two somewhat contradictory philosophy. The first was based on Enlightenment ideas of utilitarianism and rationalism and suggested that prisons should simply be used as a more effective substitute for public corporal punishments such as wiping and hanging. This theory, referred to as deterrence, claims that the primary purpose of prison is to be so harsh and terrifying that they deter people from committing crimes out of fear and going to prison. The second theory, which saw prisons as a form of rehabilitation or moral reform, was based on religious ideas that equated crime with sin and saw prison as a place to instruct prisoners in Christian morality, obedience, and proper behavior. These later reformers believed that prisoners could be constructed as humane institutions of moral instruction and that prisoners' behavior could be corrected so that when they were released, they would be model members of society. So, ang mga prisoners kay gikuan sila kanang gi gi-guidance sila sa mga chaplains, mga diacons by using the faith-based teaching like Bibles nana para ma-reform sila ug mahimo silang model become a good model in the society ini mabalik na sila sa community. Prison reform movement. John Howard was one of the most notable early prison reformers, having visited several hundred prisons across Great Britain and Europe in his capacity as High Sheriff and Bedfordshire. He published The State of the Prisons in 1777. So, si John Howard, usa ni sa mga prison reformers aside ni Foucault. He proposed wide-ranging reforms to the system, including the housing of each prisoner in a separate cell and the requirements that staff should be professional and paid by the government, that outside inspection of prisons should be imposed, that the prisoners should be provided with a healthy diet and reasonable living conditions. The prison reform charity, the Howard League for Penal Reform, was established in 1866 yet by his admirers. So si John Howard iyang gipangusgan nga ang prisoner should be uh, tagaag pagtagad. So ang prisoner should be provided with healthy diet o reasonable living conditions. So tagaan jog kanang sakto pinuy-anan sa prisuhan. Following Howard's agitation, the Penitentiary Act was passed in 1779. This introduced solitary confinement, religious instruction, a labor regime, and proposed two state penitentiaries, one for men and one for women. The development of modern prison. The theory of the modern prison system was born in London, influenced by the utilitarianism of Jeremy Bentham. Bentham's panopticon introduced the principle of observation and control that underpins the design of the modern prison. The notion of prisoner being incarcerated as part of their punishment and not simply as a holding state until trial or hanging was at that was at the time revolutionary. So sa karon ay sa panahon ni Jeremy Bentham nang giwala na ang execution like hanging or basta sa mga death penalty kay giusob niya ng silbi ang mga prisoner kay i-incarcerated lamang sa pila ka years. His views influenced the establishment of the first prisons used as criminal rehabilitation center. So mao ni ang design sa center. At a time when the implementation of capital punishment for a variety of relatively trivial offenses was on the decline, the notion of incarceration as a form of punishment and correction held great appeal to reform-minded thinkers and politicians. 19th century. In the first half of the 19th century, capital punishment came to be regarded as appropriate for many crimes that it had previously been carried out for, and by mid-19th century, imprisonment had replaced the death penalty for the most serious offenses except for murder. So, mao ni ang time nga giwala na jud ang death penalty, gilisan na siya og incarceration or imprisonment. The first state prison in England was the Millbank Prison, established in 1816 with a capacity for just under 1,000 inmates. So, mao ni ang design. So, mao ni siyang Millbank Prison, ang kinaunang state prison sa England. Then, maka-occupied siya og 1,000 inmates. By 1824, 54 prisons had adopted the disciplinary system advocated by the SIPD. By the 1840s, penal transportation to Australia and the use of hawks was on the decline, and the Surveyor General of Convict Prisons, Joshua Hebb, set an ambitious program of prison building in the country, with one large prison opening per year. So si Joshua Webb kay naging siya program nga magtukod og prison building sa iyang nasod nga kanang dagko kanang mga supermax nga prison. Pentonville Prison opened in 1842, beginning a trend of ever-increasing incarceration rates and the use of prison as the primary form of crime punishment. So, diri na ang time nga kanang ang imprisonment as being used or primary form of crime punishment. So, dili na katong mga harsh punishments like kanang mga barbaric na. So, naka-evolve na ang punishment system. Robert Peel's Ghost Act of 1823 introduced regular visits to prisoners by chaplains, provided for the payment of jailers, and prohibited the use of irons and manacles. So si Robert Peel kay nagkuhan siya mo'y nag-introduce no nga ang prison butngan og pabisitahon og mga chaplains bantay mo tong chaplains katong mga pastors or mga volunteers, mga pare nga kuan kanang maoy silbi mo tabang nila og reform kanang gaan sila og guidance nila through faith-based program kanang religious type nga kuan pag guide like reading Bibles, mag-ampo through prayer inana siya. The purpose of punishment. So ang purpose sa imprisonment, number 1, punishment. deprivation of freedom, or removal from the free society, sentencers usually consider the legitimate expectation of the public, deciding on a sentence that supports his objective because unless the public regard this punishment as at least in some respect fitting the crime, respect for the law will be diminished. So punishment as a punishment kay kanang ang mga offenders kay kwaon sila sa society, so i ikuan sila i-custody, i-incapacitate kanang prisuhon para panisyan para dili na sila ka freely makaadto sa society. So number two, deterrence. The idea is that convicted offenders will not repeat the crime because the punishment taught him the consequences of offending. It also serves to caution others against committing similar crime when they see the degree of punishment a convicted person gets. Long sentences or death penalty produce both specific and general deterrence. Light and non-custodial sentences have a very little, if any, deterrent effect either to the actual offender or those who may commit such crimes in the future. So deterrence mo ni ang time nga patabngon ang piniriso or ang offender para dili na sila mo usab og commit anang crime kay once nga patabngon ang usa ka prisoner kibalo sila nga unsa ni ka kabug-aton nga nga punishment kay makakuha na sila ma di na nila usab di na usbon di na mabuhat og usab para di na sila mapanisyan og inato. So protection of the public, the objective focuses on the need of the community for protection from the crimes of convicted persons. This is particularly relevant to societies experiencing abnormally high rates of violent crimes such as murders, wounding, drug trafficking, and gun-related crimes. Jamaica is one such country. Sentences often take note of the fact that when certain violent offenders and gang members are imprisoned, violent crimes tend to fall drastically in communities they normally impact. Donald Zeke Pepys, Christopher Dudus Coke, Tisha Miller, Joel Andem, and Christopher Dogpo Linton are among several convicted offenders whose incarceration have resulted in significant declines in violent crimes across several communities and nationally. Number four is rehabilitation. So, ang purpose sa imprisonment kay ang rehabilitation. This is our sentencing objective where the sentencer is convinced that the offender has a need for remediation. Some persons argue that for this sentencing objective to be met, the offender must have a lead normal law-abiding life prior to his arrest for crime, has accepted responsibility for his crime, has shown remorse, and promised that he will take advantage of opportunities for rehabilitation. So, rehab ang mga prisoner kanang makita para kanang makita jud sa mga piniriso nga nagkuhan sila hinulsol sila or nagmahay sila nganong ilang gibuhat kato nga crime. So, ang purpose sa pagrehab kay para ma ma-restore ang person, ma-restore ang piniriso para mahimo siyang a better model inigbalik sa society. So, Age of Enlightenment. The Age of Enlightenment, also known as the Enlightenment, it was an intellectual and philosophical movement that dominated Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries with global influences and effects. The Enlightenment included a range of ideas centered on the value of human happiness, the pursuit of knowledge obtained by means of reason and the evidence of the senses, and ideals such as liberty, progress, toleration, fraternity, constitutional government, and separation of church and state. Some date the beginning of the Enlightenment publication back to the publication of René Descartes' Discourse on the Method in 1637, featuring his famous dictum cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. Others cite the publication in Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica 1687 as the culmination of the scientific revolution and the beginning of the Enlightenment. European historians traditionally date its beginning with the death of Louis XIV of France in 1715 and its end with the 1789 outbreak of the French Revolution. Many historians now date the end of the Enlightenment as the start of the 19th century, with the latest proposed year being the death of Immanuel Kant. The Enlightenment philosophers. Number 1. Thomas Hobbes. In nature, people were cruel, greedy, and selfish. They would fight, rob, and oppress one another. To escape these people would enter into a social contract. They would give up their freedom in return for the safety and order to organize society. Therefore, Hobbes believed that a powerful government, like absolute monarchy, was best for society. It would impose order and compel obedience. It was also able to suppress rebellion. So, Monica Thomas Hobbes, ang social contract. Next is John Locke, believe in natural laws and natural rights. At birth, the mind is a tabula rasa, a blank tablet. Everything we know comes from the experience of the senses, empiricism. We are born with rights because they are a part of nature, of our very existence. They come from God. At birth, people have the right to life, liberty, and property. Most famous works are the two treatises on government. So, mo ni iyang work kaning two treatises on government. Then, John Locke believe sa natural laws and natural rights. Then, niya sad gidiscuss ang kuan nga atong utok daw is like a blank tablet, meaning kanang ang ato ang mga nature rights, mga kuan, mga behavior, mga personalities is maato ra makatunan while kita madako ta. Mura og kining has silbi atong behavior or character ma-shape tungod sa society or sa atong family ba na rules and governments have an obligation and responsibility to protect the natural rights of the people it governs. If a government fails in its obligation to protect natural rights, the people have the right to overthrow that government. The best government is one which is accepted by all the people, which has limited power, like English monarchy where laws limited the power of the king. Locke's ideas influenced Thomas Jefferson more than anything else when Jefferson wrote the U.S. Declaration of Independence in 1776. Locke justified revolution in the eyes of the founding fathers. Locke also influenced later revolution in France, 1789, and in many or other places in the world in 19th century. So si Locke mo naka-influence sa revol- nag-start og revolution ang France. So og di ra pud sa France siya naka-influence pati sa uban nga nasod. John John Jacob Rousseau, 1712 to 1778. People are basically good but become corrupted by society, like the absolute monarchy in France. For Rousseau, for Rousseau, the social contract was the path to freedom. People should do what is best for their community. So Rousseau was also gonna agree to social contract for the best for their community. The general will should direct the state toward the common good. Hence, the good of the community is more important than individual interests. His most famous work was The Social Contract. GGR questioned authority, absolute monarchy, and religion, and was passionate. He hated political and economic oppression, influenced later revolutionaries, both middle class and socialists. Next is Baron de Montesquieu. He strongly criticized absolute monarchy and has a voice for democracy. Separation of powers. The best way to protect liberty was to divide the powers of government into three branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. So siya di ang nagkuan ni the pioneer, or siya mo'y nagsiulo nga best way to protect liberty and i-divide siya ang power sa government into three branches, like the legislative, executive, and the judicial. Checks and balances. Each branch of government should check the power of the other two branches. Thus, power would be balanced and no one branch would be too powerful. Montes- Montesquieu studied the history of governments and cultures all over the world. His first book, The Persian Letters, ridiculed the absolute monarchy and social classes in France. He also wrote The Spirit of the Laws. So mo ni siya ang book, mo ni ang book niya, book ni Montesquieu, ang Persian Letters. Montesquieu's separation of powers and checks and balances greatly influenced James Madison and the other framers of the U.S. Constitution. These ideas are the core of American government to this day. So, grabe kay influence ni si Montesquieu sa US Constitution. Voltaire, 1694-1778, advocate freedom of thought, speechless politics, and religion. Fought against intolerance, injustice, inequality, ignorance, and superstition. Attack idle aristocrats, corrupt government officials, religious prejudice, and slave trade. He often had to express his views indirectly through fictional characters because he lived in an absolute monarchy in France. So, kani si Voltaire, mura po ni siya si, ako, ma-example kay mura si atong national hero nga si Dr. Jose Rizal, kay si Big express ang iyang view sa usa ka government through pagsulat, no? Like sa Lolimitang Here and El Fili. So kani si Voltaire, most of iyang style, iyang express ang iyang mga iyang mga views pinaagi sa pagsulat. So iyang giattack ani is the aristocrats, especially for the corrupt government officials, mga religious prejudice o mga slave trade. So mo na iyang mga sagaran nga gipang-attack sa iyang mga sulat. Wrote the famous novel Candide. Voltaire often used a razor-sharp humor, a cutting sarcasm in his writings. He was imprisoned in the Bastille in Paris and exiled because of his attacks on the French government and the Catholic Church. Voltaire's books were outlawed, even burned by the authorities. So, as same sa ka Dr. Si Rizal, Voltaire was also imprisoned and exiled kay tungod iyang gi-atake or iyang gipadungdungogan ang iyang fiction nga novel sa French. Iyang gipego ang French government o ang Catholic Church. Then ang iyang sukad ato ang iyang mga books, iyang mga hinimo kay gisunog. Denis Diderot. This philosopher worked 25 years to produce a 28-volume encyclopedia, the first one. The encyclopedia was not just a collection of the articles of human knowledge. It was intended to change the way people thought. Montesquieu, Voltaire, and others wrote articles. About 20,000 copies were printed between 1751 and 1789, despite efforts to ban the encyclopedia. Articles in the encyclopedia supported freedom of expression and education for all people. So, si Denis Diderot day ang founder ani nga encyclopedia. Like, unsa tong naa karon? Say, di ta mag-browse sa atong mga information, mga research. So, si Denis Diderot kay nag-collect sa mga articles and human knowledge, especially nila Montesquieu, Voltaire, and other articles nga kuan sa gobyerno, sa government nga ipa-close kay tungod sa kuan murag giatake na sila sa government. So mo to iban unta ang encyclopedia. The divine right theory was criticized along the traditional religions. The French king said the encyclopedia was attacked the public morals. So mao ni ang naa sa iyang article, the divine right theory. So mao ni nungdan nganong ipaban sa French government. The Pope threatened to excommunicate Catholics who bought or read encyclopedia. Mary Wollstonecraft. She argued that women had been included in the Enlightenment slogan free and equal. Women had been excluded from the social contract. Her arguments were often met with scorn, even from someone Enlightenment men. Wollstonecraft and Catherine Macaulay were British feminists. The most famous French feminist was Germaine de Stael. So si Mary Wollstonecraft kay yang gipaglaban ang kanang equality, gender equality. She wrote Vindication of the Rights of the Woman in 1792. Wollstonecraft believed in equal education for girls and boys. Only education could give women the knowledge to participate equally with men in public life. She did argue that a woman's first duty was to be a good mother, but a woman could also decide on her own what is in her interest without depending on her husband. Next is Adam Smith, 1723-1790. Smith was an Scottish economist who has been called the father of capitalism. He was an advocate of laissez-faire French for let do, let go, let pass, often referred to as hands-off. Laissez-faire was a theory of the natural laws of economics. Business should operate with little or no government interference. He wrote The Wealth of Nations. So, mo ni iyang book ni Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations. Smith argued the free market of supply and demand should drive economies. The hidden hand of competition was the only regulation an economy needed. Wherever there was demand for goods or service, suppliers would compete with each other to meet and demand in order to make profit. Smith did believe that government had a duty to protect society and to provide justice public works. The development prisons. Sing Sing Prison. Sing Sing in full Sing Sing Correctional Facility, maximum security prison located in Ossining, New York. In use since 1826, it is one of the oldest penal institutions in the United States. It is also among the most well-known in the country, especially notable for its harsh conditions in the 19th and 20th century. Originally known as the Mount Pleasant Prison, it was constructed in the village of Sing Sing on the east bank of the Hudson River, some 30 miles (48 kilometers) north of New York City. It was designed to provide additional prison space and to replace Newgate Prison. Construction was undertaken in 1825 by convict laborers. So, ang natrabaho ani kay katorya pong mga piniriso. Construct, Construction was undertaken by convicted laborers under the supervision of Elam Lins, warden of Auburn State Prison. He officially became head of the new prison when it opened in 1826, though it was completed until 1828. The initial facility had 800 cells. The prison population rose in the mid-19th century, resulting in more construction. The four-story complex was soon six stories, and the prison eventually housed more than 1,600 inmates. Because most of the early convicted criminals traveled by boat to Sing Sing, the praise up the river came to mean going to prison. So, nag nagkadugay, nagka-increase. So, from gamay nga story nga building, hantod naka third story, naka four-story building, hantod na six-story building, hantod nakadagan na jud ang ilang mga facilities. One of the notable visitors to the prison was Alexis de Tocqueville, author of The Democracy in America. The French government sent him and Gustave de Beaumont to the United States in 1831 to gather information about the American penal system. The two men were amazed at the total subjugation under which prisoners worked and the administrative power the warden wielded at Sing Sing. Whippings and floggings were commonplace punishments in Sing Sing. Frequently used was the cat-o'-nine-tails, a cruel whipping contraception whose lashes were often tipped with metal or barbs. Its use was finally abolished by the New York State Legislature in 1848. So, ilang punishment is whippings and floggings. So, mo ni example sa whippings kanang bunalan ka. In addition, while Lynch was warden, inmates were expected to refrain from making noise, which included talking. With the advent of the electric chair in 1891, Sing Sing became notorious for its execution, although the electric chair was developed and neighboring Auburn. Almost all executions within the state were carried out the Sing Sing until 1963. The infamous death chair was later moved to Green Haven Prison. So, sa Sing Sing Prison is nag-exist pod ang death penalty. So, mao ni ilang gamit electric chair. Sing Sing was also the site of reforms that affected the national penal system. Reformer Thomas Mott Osborne, who developed his penology theories while voluntarily incarcerated for a year at Auburn, served as Sing Sing's warden in 1914, 15, and 1916, but his immediate sweeping changes were assailed, and he resigned under intense political pressure. During his tenure, however, the first psychological work with inmates began. More reforms were instituted under Lewis Edward Laws, who served as warden from 1920 to 1941. He notably improved the living condition within the prison and allowed inmates to participate in sports. So, so si Lewis kay gi-allow niya ang mga prisoners nga mag-participate og sports. Auburn State Prison, located in Auburn, New York, opened in 1816. It established a disciplinary and administrative system based on silence, corporal punishment, and congregate labor. In architecture and routine, Auburn became the model for prison throughout the United States. So, in the early 19th century, many Americans believed that industrialization and dramatic demographic, economic, and political upheavals and conspired against the traditional controls of family, church, and community. From their perspective, these moral guardians could no longer adequate control disorder. They saw crime as the product of social chaos. Necessary to its eradication was a structure environment in which deviance could be separated from the disorder of society and the contagion of one another. Other solution was to create penitentiary, a new institution for reforming offenders and ultimately restoring social stability. Newborn originally used congregate cells, but in 1821, Warden William Britton borrowed the concept of solitary cells from the so-called Pennsylvania system. Britain designed a unique five-tiered cell block to two rows of single cells, placed back to the cells measure only 3.5 feet, 1.06 meters wide, 7.5 feet to 2.3 meters long, and 7 feet, 2.1 meters high. Doors face outer walls lined with grated windows that provided indirect light and air. So, mao ni siya ang ilang cell. This pattern of small inside cell blocks was later adopted by most state prisons in the United States, whereas the Pennsylvania system inmates did handicraft work in their cells. Urban prisoner labored in congregate workshops, offsetting imprisonment caused by fulfilling private industry contracts. A hidden passageway with small openings surrounded the work area, allowing inspectors and visitors to surreptitiously monitor the inmates. Auburn briefly implemented a three-level classification system. Under the minor offenders labored in workshops during the day and retired to separate cells at night. Serious offenders alternated their days between solitary confinement and congregate work. The most hardened criminals were placed under solitary confinement without work. After numerous suicides, instances of mental illness, and attempted escapes, the governor of New York terminated the classification system and experiment the solitary confinement. So pag abot ang panahon nga katong mga maximum security nga mga criminals kay gilain sila, so meaning na kuan ilang mga hunahuna di sila ka kuan sa kalubilo sa uban nga ka prisoner, so nay uban nag-suicide. So naka-decide ang governor sa New York nga ilisan ang classification system to solitary confinement. I mean giwala ang classification system ug ang pag-experience sa solitary confinement. Subsequently, all male inmates work in congregate shops by day, returning to individual cells at night. So, tanang male kay nag-work sa shop then mubalik sa adlaw. Well, ini kagabi mubalik na pud sila sa ilang individual cells. Females first committed to urban in 1825 were relegated an attic and excluded from regular work and exercise. To ensure the inmates did not corrupt another Britain successor, Elma Wins enforced a quasi-military routine or absolute silence, strict discipline, and economic productivity in response to bells. Head-shaven inmates dressed in stripped clothes silently march in lockstep formation and from their cells for meals and work assignments. So, mo ni ilang formation nga upaw sila og kana maglinya mo tawag og lockstep. So letters were banned and the chaplain was the only occasional visitor. Flogging and other forms of corporal punishment enforced the rules. Such regiment was thought necessary to restrain the rebellious nature of offenders. So ang letters kay pag-send og mga letters kay giban then ang only makasulod or makabisit sa prison kay ang mga chaplains. Unlike Gilborn or Sing Sing, Pennsylvania system penitentiary 1829 was intended to keep convicts separate even as they work, in order to prevent any earthly contamination or destruction that might impede their repentance. Hence, the term penitentiary, located on Cherry Hill on the outskirts of Philadelphia, Eastern represented one of the achievements in the United States to date, and it contained innovations such as running water and flush toilets in all cells. In Pennsylvania system, in 1829, the Eastern State Penitentiary on Cherry Hill in Philadelphia applied his so-called separate philosophy. Prisoners were kept in solitary confinement in cells 16 feet high, nearly 12 feet long, and 7.5 feet wide. An exercise yard completely exposed in prevent contact among prisoners was attached to each cell. Prisoners so no one except institution officers and occasional visitors. Solitary penitence, however, was soon modified to include the performance of work such as showmaking or weaving. So, buhat sa mga sa mga prisoners uban kay nagbuhat sila mga sapatos o nagtahi. Nagbuhat sa sapatos, nagweaving. The Pennsylvania system spread until it predominated in European prisons. Critics in the United States argued that it was too costly and had deleterious effects on the minds of the prisoners. The Pennsylvania system was superseded in the United States by the Auburn system. The different types of criminal punishment. First is incapacitation. Seeks to prevent future crime by physically moving criminals away from society. This punishment can be traced to ancient times. Tenants made on Hung Lu right in punishment. A comparative historical perspective, banishment was the common penalty of antiquity. Later, it was the common for colonizing European countries to ship convicts and undesirables overseas. In modern times, house arrest, incarceration, and the death penalty and all forms of incapacitation. So kato na kaning type is katong pagdakop na sa ka-prisoner sa gikan sa society. So prisohon na ni sila. Deterrence, he action ni discouraging an action an event through instilling doubt or fear of the consequence. The goal of deterrence is to persuade citizens and possible offender or re-offenders to conform to the rules of law. So deterrence is kuan kana patamngon ang mga prisoners nga mao dinhi kana ang ilahang punishment then maka kuan sila kini naka nahuna sila nga dili day maayo usbon makabutang nga mao ni time nga magmahay sila sa ilang mga gibuhat. Mead and Liu explain the four types of the deterrents are generally recognized. Specific deterrence analyze how effective punishment is on an individual's future behavior. Generally, deterrence seeks to understand how individual punishment can deter others from committing crimes. 3. Marginal deterrence seeks to reconcile how effective different types of punishment are as either specific or general deterrence. Number 4. Partial deterrence refers to the situation in which the threat of penalty has some deterrent value even when someone engages in illegal behavior. For example, criminals simply robbing a victim instead of also causing physical harm. Next is retribution. As one of the oldest forms of punishment, retribution has roots in the Judeo-Christian tradition of justice. It's her book, Criminal Law. Lisa M. Story explains that retribution prevents crime by giving victims to the society a certain sense of satisfaction that the defendant has been punished appropriately, reinforcing the belief that the criminal justice system is working effectively. Next is rehabilitation. A common prison policy in the America up until the 1970s, rehabilitation focused on helping criminals and prisoners overcome the barriers that lead them to committing criminal acts. This includes the developing occupational skills as well as resolving psychological issues such as drug addiction and aggression, explains the American Psychological Association APA. So, ang rehabilitation is pag-restore sa usa ka prisoner from kuan from disorder. So, tabangan ang mga prisoner para magbag-o para inig balik na nila sa society is kuan na sila better person na sila. Restoration, a radically different approach to criminal punishment. The goal of restoration is for the offender to make direct amends to both the victim and the community in which the crime has committed. Although a relatively new practice in modern times, has the concept of restorative justice can be found in the early legal systems of Western Europe, ancient Hebrew justice and pre-colonial societies. So, kauban na niya po ni sa rehabilitation, no, kanang pag ani restoration is kanang pag-restore sa imong kagalingon, pagbalik, pagbag-o diha with the guide of Jesus Christ kanang ngay kagpasaylo niya and you truly kana naghinulsol sa imong mga sala o mag-usab na ka. So, mao ni ang restoration. During the process of restoration, victims initiate a process in which both they are and the offender meet to share feelings and concerns. The dialogue offers the victims the opportunity to be heard and the offender to make amends and receive forgiveness. Restorative justice is too often to use crimes involving youth offenders. So, magtabi ang both offender o ang biktima. So, misturya ang prisoner nga nagmahay siya, nga siya pasaylo sa biktima. Personalities behind correctional institution. First is Cesare Beccaria. Cesare Beccaria involved Cesar Bonisana Marquis de Beccaria, born March 15, 1738, Milan, Italy. Died November 28, 1794, Milan. He is Italian criminologist and economist whose De Delite e del Pini, meaning crimes and punishment. was the deliberated volume of the reform and criminal justice. Beccaria was the son of the Milanese aristocrat of modest means. From an early age, he displayed the essential traits of his character. A highly volatile temperament resulted in periods of enthusiasm followed by depression and inactivity. He was reserved and somewhat taciturn in his social contacts but placed great value on his personal and family relationships. Next is Cesare Lombroso. Described as the father of modern criminology, Cesare Lombroso's theory of the born criminal dominated thinking about criminal behavior in the late 19th and 20th, early 20th century. November 6, 1835, October 19, 1909 was the founder of the Italian School of Positivist Criminology. So siya ang founder ani nga positivist si Cesare Lombroso. He rejected the established classical school which held that crime was a characteristic trait of human nature and that rational choices were the foundation of behavior. Lombroso using a scientific approach and concept drawn from physiognomy, early eugenics, psychiatry, and social Darwinism argued that criminality was inherited, that the born criminal would be identified the physical defects which confirm as criminal savage or atavistic. Next is William the Conqueror. William the First, Benami William, by name William the Conqueror or William the Bastard or William Normandy. French Guillaume le Conquérant or Guillaume le Bâtard or Guillaume de Normandy. Born on 1028 Falaise, Normandy or France. Died September 9, 1087. Duke of Normandy as William II from 1035 and the King of England from 1066, one of the greatest soldiers and rulers of the Middle Ages. He made himself the mightiest noble in the France and then changed to course England's history by his conquest of the country. Next is Enrico Ferri. Ferri was born in Lombardy in 1856 and worked first as a lecturer and later as a professor of criminal law. Having spent time as student of Cesare Lombroso, while Lombroso researched anthropological criminology, Ferri focused more on social and economic influences on the criminal and crime rates. So, mao ni siya, si Enrico Ferri, siya ang professor of criminal law. Ferri's research led to him postulating theories calling for crime prevention methods to be the mainstay of law enforcement as opposed to punishment of criminals after their crimes has been placed. He became the founder of positivist school and he researched psychological and social positivism as opposed to the biological positivism of Lombroso. So, nag-research siya ay siya mo'y founder sa positivism. So, iyang gi-oppose ang biological theory ni Cesare Lombroso. Next is Clifford Shaw. Clifford Robb Shaw was an American sociologist and criminologist. He was a major figure in the Chicago School of Sociology during the 1930s and 1940s and is considered to be one of the most influential figures in American criminology. His work on juvenile delinquency with Henry D. McKay, conducted in the late 1920s, played a pivotal role in moving the study of such delinquency toward the discipline of sociology and away from psychology and psychiatry. Shaw and McKay's work spanned three general areas: studying geographic variation in rates of juvenile delinquency, the study of autobiographical works by delinquents, and the development of the Chicago Area Project, a delinquency prevention program in the Chicago area. The two studies published by Shaw and McKay in the 1930s and 1940s were still held in high regard among social scientists in 1970s. So juvenile delinquency meaning kanining mga kuan nag-commit og crime, person who commit a crime, especially kani sa mga kuan teenager o sa mga bata under 18 years old. So mo ni sila mga ginatawag og juvenile delinquency kaning mga bata nga nag-commit og crime. So that's all. Thank you for listening. Have a good day.